Now, as discussed, logic may be defined as the organized body of knowledge or science that evaluates arguments. Furthermore, arguments are constituted by premises and conclusions. A premise is a statement put forth to support a conclusion, and a conclusion is a statement that is being supported by at least one premise. So, two of the most essential components of an argument, premises and conclusions, are constituted by statements. These statements are also related to each other in an argument. They're related in the sense that the premise or premises are statements that provide support for the conclusion, and the conclusion is the statement that is being supported by the premise or premises. Furthermore, there are several different types of statements: simple statements, compound statements, and categorical statements. These statements are types of statements that constitute or comprise arguments. Also, as we have discussed, simple statements and compound statements belong to the system of propositional logic, whereas categorical statements belong to the system of syllogistic logic developed by Aristotle. Now, although we can translate all categorical statements into statements in propositional logic, and some statements in propositional logic into categorical statements, it's best to keep in mind that these two different systems of logic are distinct, and that the statements within these systems are treated differently. Furthermore, because the statements in these two systems are treated differently, the arguments that these statements compose are also treated differently. Now, because arguments are constituted by premises and conclusions, it's important for us to be able to recognize premises and conclusions in order to recognize arguments. One way that we can recognize premises and conclusions are by premise indicators and conclusion indicators. Premise indicators are words or phrases that come before a premise and indicates that the following statement or statements is or are premises. Some examples of premise indicators are words like because, since, given that, and inasmuch as. Your book also contains more examples of premise indicators. I suggest that you become familiar with these premise indicators because they will come in very handy in the future in helping you identify premises as well as arguments. Now consider the argument, cats are warm-blooded since all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals. In this argument, a premise indicator is being used in order to indicate what statements are premises. Furthermore, it's not only the case that this premise indicator helps us identify the premises, it also helps us identify the conclusion. Because an argument has to contain both a conclusion and at least one premise, if we are able to identify all the premises to an argument, then by elimination, the remaining statement is going to be the conclusion. However, this strategy of identifying conclusions by elimination using premise indicators will only work if the argument that we have is only composed of statements that are premises and conclusions. Sometimes an argument will contain irrelevant statements which provide contextual information but are considered irrelevant because they are neither premises nor conclusions. If you are unaware of what irrelevant statements are actually relevant, the process of elimination by identifying premise indicators in order to identify the conclusion will not be helpful. However, in our example about cats being warm-blooded, it happens to be the case that all the statements in this argument are relevant statements. In other words, all the statements in this argument are either a premise or a conclusion. Now this argument contains the premise indicator since, and as we can see, the word since comes before the statements all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are warm-blooded. Because the word since, which is a premise indicator, comes before the statement all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals, it's the case that the premise indicator since is indicating to us that this statement is a premise. Now, one thing to notice about this argument is that the premises or premise is either a conjunction, the statement, all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals, or two categorical statements, all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals. Now, neither of these interpretations are actually incorrect. We can understand this argument as containing either one premise, which is a conjunction, or two premises, which are two categorical statements. What will determine whether or not we interpret this argument as having one premise or two premises is our decision to evaluate this argument within either the system of propositional logic or the system of syllogistic logic. For the time being, I will treat this argument as if it were being evaluated within the system of syllogistic logic. So, I will speak of this argument as containing two premises and one conclusion. Now, even though this argument contains two premises and one conclusion, and there's only one premise indicator, the word since, it's still the case that the premise indicator since is indicating to us that both the statements all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals are both premises. The reason for this is because the word and is actually telling us that the premise indicator since applies to both statements, both the statement all mammals are warm-blooded and the statement cats are mammals. Now, because the premise indicator since helped us identify two out of the three statements in this argument as being premises, it also helps us identify the only other statement left as being a conclusion. This is especially the case because arguments must contain both premises and conclusion. So if two out of the three statements that occur in the argument are premises, then the only other statement must be a conclusion if the argument that's given is actually an argument. Conclusions, on the other hand, can be identified by conclusion indicators. Conclusion indicators are words or phrases that come before a conclusion and indicates that the following statement or statements is or are conclusions. Examples of conclusion indicators are words like so, therefore, it must be that, and it follows that. Your book also contains more examples of conclusion indicators. Like premise indicators, I suggest you become familiar with these conclusion indicators. They will come in very handy in the future in helping you identify not only premises and conclusions, but also arguments. Now consider this example of an argument. Since all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are mammals, it follows that cats are warm-blooded. In this argument, we have a premise indicator being used as well as a conclusion indicator. The conclusion indicator, it follows that, occurs before the conclusion, which is cats are warm-blooded. So it indicates to us, it literally points to the statement that is the conclusion. And the premise indicator, since, again indicates that the premises are all mammals are warm-blooded and cats are warm-blooded. Now in this example, because it's the case that we only have three statements in this argument, and all three statements are indicated by either a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator that they are either premises or a conclusion, there's no ambiguity or question as to what statement the author is putting forth as the conclusion and what statements the author is putting forth as the premises. In the future, I recommend that you yourself use premise indicators and conclusion indicators as much as possible in order to be very clear about what you are using as a premise and what you are using as a conclusion. Now, although premise indicators and conclusion indicators are very helpful in helping us identify premises and conclusions to an argument, it's very important that you understand a couple of things. First of all, sometimes an argument will not have either a premise or a conclusion indicator. In other words, there are no phrases or words that will help you identify what statement is a premise and what statement is a conclusion. In such cases, what you'll have to do is ask yourself, what statement or statements support what other statement or statements? Once you ask this question, if you can figure out which statement or statements are being supported by what other statement or statements, then you should be able to discover which statement or statements are the premises and which statement or statements are the conclusion. The statement that is being supported will always be the conclusion, and the statement or statements that are providing support will be the premises. The statements that are providing support, in other words, the premises, are the statements that are put forth as evidence to believe in the truth of the conclusion. Now, in using this strategy, you have to be very careful in reading the content or the information that's presented in the statements and trying to understand the relationship between the information in each of the statements. Furthermore, it is sometimes the case that phrases that are used as premise indicators or conclusion indicators are not used to indicate either premises or conclusions. For example, consider the statement, "I have not seen you since Thursday." In this statement, the word since is not being used as a premise indicator. What it is indicating is an amount of time. So the lesson to draw from this fact is that you should never become automatic about premise indicators and conclusion indicators. In other words, just because you see a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator, you shouldn't necessarily stop there and simply think that whatever statements that come after these indicators are premises or conclusions. You should move on to ask yourself, is it the case that these indicator words and phrases are actually being used as indicator words and phrases? Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes you'll have an argument without any premise or conclusion indicators. Consider the example we have here. We should boycott that company. They have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty, and that caused numerous injuries. Now notice how in this argument there are no premise indicators or conclusion indicators. To help us identify the premises and the conclusion of this argument, we need to think about the various statements that are in this argument and how the information that's contained in these statements can be related to each other such that one statement can be a conclusion and the other statement can be a premise. Now notice how we have the statement, "We should boycott that company," as the first statement. Now ask yourself, can this be a premise or a conclusion in relation to all the other statements? The other statements are that they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew are faulty, and that caused numerous injuries. Now, if we think about what each of these statements are saying, the most reasonable conclusion for us to draw is that the first statement is the conclusion to the second statement, which is the premise. The reason for that is because the premise, or the second statement, they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, gives us reasons to believe that it is true that we should boycott that company. So, the second statement can be used as a premise in support of the truth of the conclusion. Now, you might want to ask yourself, well, is it the case that we can actually use the first statement, "We should boycott that company," as the premise for the second statement, "They have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries," thus making the second statement the conclusion. However, if you think about the information that's in these statements, that wouldn't make much sense. Remember, premises are reasons that are given in support of the truth of a conclusion. If the first statement were a premise, "We should boycott that company," would be a reason for the conclusion, they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty, and that caused numerous injuries. But it doesn't seem to make much sense that we should boycott that company would be a reason to think that it's true that they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries. If you're finding it difficult to identify premises and conclusions within an argument when the argument does not have any premise or conclusion indicators, one thing you might try to do is to actually insert premise indicators or conclusion indicators where you think they might naturally belong. Simply repeat the argument to yourself while adding a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator where it sounds like it would naturally fit. For example, consider our argument about boycotting the company. When we repeat these arguments, we can actually insert premise indicators or conclusion indicators where they seem to naturally fit. Consider the example given below. Since they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, we should therefore boycott that company. Here we have added the premise indicator since and the conclusion indicator therefore where it seemed to naturally fit. By doing so, this helps us identify the statement they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries as the premise, and the statement we should boycott that company as the conclusion. So when you come across an argument with no clear premise indicator or conclusion indicator to help you determine what statement or statements are the premises and what statement is the conclusion, you can try the strategy of thinking about the information that are in these statements and understanding the relationships between these statements and how one could be a premise to the other statement as a conclusion. Or you can also try inserting premise indicators and conclusion indicators within the argument such that it makes sense to read the argument in a way which clearly identifies the premise as a premise and the conclusion as a conclusion. Now, you might find it difficult in the beginning in order to identify premises and conclusions to arguments. This is actually very normal, and you shouldn't be stressed out about it. As we continue on with this course, you'll also learn about structures of arguments and different types of arguments. Now that we have a handle on identifying premises and conclusions, which are two essential components of arguments, let us now turn to the third and final essential component of an argument. Arguments are not only constituted by premises and conclusions, they are also constituted by a third element. This third element can be captured by the notion of support. The notion of support refers to the inferential link between a conclusion and its premises. It is the relationship between the conclusion and the premises that allows the premises to act as evidence for the truth of the conclusion. It is within this notion of support that all arguments have that we can find the inferential claim that is being made by any argument. The inferential claim is the claim that something, a premise, is being put forth in support of a conclusion. So the inferential claim is basically constituted by the fact that the premises are being put forth as support for the conclusion. So there are in fact three essential components of an argument. Every argument must have at least one premise, at least one conclusion, and there must be an inferential claim of support being made within the argument. Now, given that these are the three essential components that any arguments must have, it is the case that we can distinguish arguments from non-arguments by seeing if the passages given to us contain